A very warm welcome to another episode of the Englische Woche at Marketing Made in China podcast. We are very glad to once again welcome Mattie Bekink, China Director at the Economist Intelligence Corporate Network.
Wie können deutsche Marken in China erfolgreich werden? Und welche Fallstricke lauern bei einer Produkteinführung im Reich der Mitte? Antworten auf Fragen wie diese bietet der Marketing Made in China Podcast mit Damian Maib und Thomas Derksen.
7 months ago, you talked with us mainly about the lockdowns and COVID restrictions in China and in Shanghai. Now, in the last few months, a lot has happened, and we think it's a good opportunity to catch up again. Very warm welcome again to the Marketing Made in China podcast, Mattie. We're very glad to have you here.
I'm thrilled to be with you again. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. Very welcome, Mattie, also from my side. So now more than half a year has passed since we last talked and we discussed the topic of COVID. So now COVID is still a huge topic in China. How were your last 6 months in terms of personal and professional life here in China, Shanghai?
So half of the last 6 months I was not in China. So that was, quite a change. My family and I took the decision to leave in mid-May. And mostly because our children are young enough that online learning was really terrible for them. I think online learning is really terrible for all of us. Actually, I think endless Zoom meetings are terrible for in our professional lives as adults. But for primary age children, and our youngest was still in kindergarten, and his kindergarten actually had nothing to offer online. So March 10th or 11th, when the schools closed, the kindergarten teacher called me and said, "Shinku nila, mama shinku," which is kind of like, you're going to have a really tough time. Get ready for bitterness, basically. And so it was pretty bitter. No, it was hard. So we found out that the schools in Amsterdam, the public schools where we had them before we moved back to China, would take them back. And so we let them finish out the school year with in-person learning in the Netherlands. I feel as though for those people who've gone inside and out of China at this moment, it's kind of like flipping a switch, because you go from this very extreme world where life is constantly COVID all the time. That was especially the case during the lockdown, of course, because of how extreme and restricted it was, and stressful and surreal and all of that. You almost can't believe that you've lived through it in a sense. And then just back to, it feels like going to somewhere where COVID never happened. We landed in Europe, and you just kind of can't believe that you don't have to do any tests or wear masks or do anything. And that people, yeah, sure, COVID's around, but it's not something that's causing stress. So we were really happy and fortunate and grateful to return to the Netherlands, kind of have the kids go back into school, give them that stability of, a more normal life for the end of the school year, and also to see family, both in the Netherlands and the United States, that we hadn't seen in 3 years. And then we kept our return tickets. We'd already had tickets to travel for the summer, and then came back in August. Funnily enough, you asked also about professional life. When we were thinking of leaving, I really struggled with the idea of leaving, even in the middle of lockdown and with all of the uncertainty and stress that it created, because I kind of feel one of the challenges of this moment in understanding China is that none of the analysts are in China. And I said, who am I to have credibility as a China analyst if I leave, to some extent? And it was my husband who pointed it out to me. He's like, it's not as though you're in China anyway. You haven't left this apartment in 7 weeks, or this house in 7 weeks. Like you're not out in China. Like, you could be anywhere in the world. You're doing everything on Zoom. And that was one of the things that kind of convinced me to go. But mostly it was better for the kids. So now we're back, and grateful to be back too.
You're so right. When I came back to Germany in May, it was like a movie for me, because I don't know which if it was a horror movie in Shanghai, or it was a romantic love story in Germany, because I left in the last third of the lockdown. So I came from the lockdown to a relatively normal life in Germany. And also now I'm traveling Europe. I'm in Paris right now, and Paris is even much looser than Germany. In Germany, we still have to wear masks in the bus and in the subway, on the trains. But in Paris, nobody cares. There are tourists all over, and I didn't see anyone wearing a mask. So in China, life is now totally different, right? Damian and you both are in Shanghai. They are still locked down. There are tests every day, and you can't go anywhere without your QR code. So do you think there is a way out of zero COVID where everyone can be happy with, like the leadership, the authorities, and the people?
I don't think that there's a clear path that's going to happen in the immediate future. I feel as though the language in the state media leading up to the 20th Party Congress, which just concluded, and of course Xi's remarks, particularly at the opening with his abbreviated version of the work report, the language there made very clear that zero COVID is here to stay. The all-out people's war against the virus, as it was called, will continue. And, the truth is every other country that had a zero COVID policy has now abandoned it. Taiwan, I think, being the last outlier. Every location, I do not want to offend anyone, that had a zero COVID strategy has moved away from it, Hong Kong and Taiwan being the most recent, but also Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, etc. And there is kind of a playbook to follow, and China is so far not making any of those policy choices, in particular vaccinating in a more serious way elderly and vulnerable populations. And even the data on the high level of vaccination that we have now is outdated because some of that is only 1 jab or 2 jabs, and actually you need a booster at this point because the efficacy does wear off. And so to shift to living with the virus requires vaccination, and we're not seeing that. So I don't think we're going to see a shift anytime soon. There was a lot of what I think of as speculative wishful thinking before the party congress, that post-party congress, there would be some flip of a switch, to use the same analogy, but first, that's certainly, I think, unlikely. There's also this huge COVID industrial complex that has been built up around, you mentioned, Thomas, how we're doing tests every day and scanning our QR codes, and it's kind of amazing, particularly when you return to China and do quarantine. And then when you just go about your daily life, like there's this huge amount of resources that have now been devoted in maintaining the zero COVID apparatus. I saw somewhere in the Chinese media that one of the health officials said that they have the capacity to test 1 billion people a day right now, which is just mind-boggling. I don't know if that figure is accurate, but it's quite significant. And so unraveling that will also take kind of time and energy. And then the most important piece, I think, is preparing the population to a transition away from fearing, this very deadly virus to living with the virus. And in other countries, there was this kind of period of messaging to the population because, basically Omicron is not containable. We've never gone back to zero since Omicron hit in China. But to sort of say, actually, it's not so bad. And, we're going to classify this as less of a risk and it's going to spread. People will get sick, but it's okay. Get vaccinated, prepare for the shift. And we're not seeing that. So I don't think we're going to see a shift anytime soon within the Economist Intelligence Unit. We think it'll continue at least into the first half of next year, possibly longer through the whole year, with moderation, of course. Yeah. One
follow-up question. Do you understand the zero COVID restrictions sometimes? Because it's very easy from our point of view to criticize it as a European living in Europe. But sometimes I think if you see the hospitals in China, if you see like how the medical insurance is so different to what we have in Germany, sometimes I can understand, because if just like 1% or 0.5% of the population get very severe illnesses with COVID, severe symptoms, then 0.5% in China is much, much more in absolute numbers than here in Germany or in Europe. So sometimes I have a kind of understanding for the authorities that they act like that. Is it the same with you?
Yes, I mean, it is understandable. There are some aspects of the zero COVID regime that I think people, including myself, find frustrating because they're not grounded in science. So, for example, all of the what I call performative spraying, when there's just chlorine being sprayed everywhere and repeatedly, and it doesn't do anything except, you get off the plane, you're walking to your quarantine hotel, and in your footstep, chlorine is sprayed as if I'm carrying COVID on the bottom of my shoes. I mean, that stuff, I think, that's what makes people think this is crazy. At the same time, critical care infrastructure in China is so much lower. The capacity is so much lower than in Germany or European or other kind of countries that there's a real risk the healthcare system would be overrun. And the last modeling and data that I saw on this was a report out of Fudan in May of this year that if, zero COVID were to be relaxed, there would be a wave of deaths. The estimate was 1.5 million people. And, Xi, again, again in his remarks said, the people and their lives take precedence. Like, they come first. And in particular, he's staked, taking credit personally for caring about the Chinese people more than, those Western nations, in particular the United States. You can't watch anything in China. It's calmed down a little bit because of Party Congress, but, almost every night on the evening news, it talks about how more than 1 million people died in the U.S. And so if China were to then immediately follow in the footsteps of that exact pattern, I think there would be a real credibility concern. So, they don't want to risk that wave of death and the healthcare system being overrun. And I feel as though there's kind of two sides to looking at everything related to zero COVID in China. On the one hand, there was just this news that came out last week, I believe, about this new facility going to be built in Shanghai that can house like 3,500 people or so, maybe more. And, some people said, oh gosh, this is evidence of how stringent zero COVID is going to be and we're going to have it forever. And then other people said, oh, this is evidence of an off-ramp because they're building capacity so that the hospitals won't be overwhelmed. And, you've seen these facilities being built in other places. And so but you don't know for which reason the facilities are being built. And so I think pre-Omicron, China did have an exit strategy and they were working towards it. And then Omicron kind of upended it because it was just so much more contagious. And there was a steady focus on vaccination that you saw kind of at the end of 2021. And then with the outbreaks and the lockdowns, we've just kind of reverted straight back into these very stringent kind of 2020 initial outbreak tools of containment. They've just been struggling, of course, because of how transmissible the virus is. But, they've also caused problems because they've wreaked havoc with the economy and disrupted people's livelihoods. And I think it's important to note also for listeners that it's not just a bunch of spoiled expats in Shanghai who are upset about zero COVID because we can't travel or see our families or, all the rest of it. But it's really disruptive for the lives of people across the country, particularly workers in factories that are closed or distribution centers or, people, in small to medium businesses and enterprises in the private sector that aren't receiving support as consumption has declined. And it has ripple effects through the whole society and the economy that are actually more profound, I think, than the headlines capture, because it's usually kind of the spoiled expats in Shanghai who are willing to talk to the foreign reporters about how miserable it is to be stuck in your house.
Yeah, that's true. So, Thomas, next time you come to Shanghai, you probably need to stay in the hotel for a couple of days before being allowed to do the testings for another every 2 to 3 days. But once you're out, it seems to be quite normal again.
You did it 2 or 3 times, so I can do it too.
Yeah, I did it. It's not too bad. It's not too bad. You can do it. So in our e-commerce business, we also got a couple of warehouses across China. And now recently, I think 10 days ago, one of the warehouses in Ningbo was in lockdown again. So we cannot ship out any goods, which affects the sales. I'm sure that our company is not the only one. So it also has severe effects on the economy, not only on the personal lives. And now, just a couple of days ago, you've mentioned that another decade has literally started since the big party congress has come to an end in Beijing over the weekend. Can you summarize the most important learnings from us, for us and for our listeners?
I mean, I think the headline is "She's the one," right? I mean, she is here to stay. He's kind of stayed on for an unprecedented third term. That was not surprising. I think there were some surprises, but the surprises even indicate to me that the slow consolidation of power and kind of the end of collective governance that we'd saw built up within the party since Deng Xiaoping is definitively over. That we already had seen kind of a centralization of power, and that perhaps led to some rigidity in governance and decision making that was evident especially in Xi's second term. Obviously, it was the last party congress when he amended the party charter to allow himself to stay on, and he did not have a successor lined up. This time there was also no successor identified. And I think one of the most surprising and or controversial decisions was that Li Qiang, who is the party secretary in Shanghai, who oversaw, the lockdown, the shambolic response to the COVID outbreak earlier this year, was promoted to number 2. We won't know the official titles of the Politburo Standing Committee members until the 2 sessions in March, the next legislative session. But because he's in the number 2 spot it's likely that he will be premier. And I think that's really interesting. Actually, at the EIU a year ago, we picked him we'd forecasted that he would become premier, breaking precedent because he's not been executive vice premier, which is usually a requirement for that role, or conventionally that's been a requirement. And then after the lockdown, we revised our forecast because it was really uncertain whether, the person who'd overseen this kind of catastrophic situation would be promoted or not. But it certainly indicates that loyalty to Xi, which is something that all of the current members of the Politburo Standing Committee have, takes precedence essentially over anything else. And, again, I feel as though this is something where there's two ways to look at it. So one, it's either if you're a lower level cadre whose head rolled, who lost your job because of a much smaller outbreak of COVID on your watch, and then you see, the person who oversaw Shanghai's disastrous lockdown be promoted, you must be quite frustrated right now, because what does that mean about meritocracy within the party, which was, of course, something that was, promoted over the last few decades, and that's, I think, an interesting way to look at it. Or you can look at it as, Li Qiang, who had been starting to allegedly experiment with moving away from extreme zero COVID and kind of let Shanghai open up, live with the virus a little bit. Then he came into line when faced with a real outbreak, and that demonstration of loyalty is actually what allowed him to rise up. So it was a success. It wasn't a failure, right? So you can see it as a failure in that it was this horrible lockdown that we all lived through and the economy was tanked, or it was a success because he towed the party line and adhered to Xi's policy. Sorry, that's a little bit off track because I think for those of us in Shanghai, Li's promotion is very interesting. But I mean, the main takeaway is that we have really moved squarely into a period of ideological as opposed to pragmatic rule, where it's clear that in Mr. Xi's administrative hierarchy, politics and national security come above economics.
So then economics is the key word for our next question, because a lot of foreign business, German business, European business are quite successful, or were quite successful in the last decades in China. It started from a factory country where where business produced things. Now it's a huge consumer market where foreign brands sell a lot of things. What do you think after zero COVID, after the party congress? Is there a need for a shift of company policies or company strategies for foreign business? Do you think it will be harder to make business in the next 5 to 10 years in China?
I think the challenge for whether it's German businesses or any foreign businesses is that the kind of reliability of the Chinese market is kind of in question, right? So China's been the most reliable and largest source of global growth for the last 2 decades. It's accounted for 25% of global GDP growth during that time. And that's no longer the case. Some of the headwinds in China's economy right now are global. It's not as though Europe is doing fantastically at the moment or anywhere in the world. There are some big global trends that are problematic. Some are quite specific to China, like the property sector distress. And then some I feel are kind of more in China's control, like the zero COVID, which I think above all that, zero COVID just has a chokehold on the economy at the moment. And I don't think you're going to see consumer or investor sentiment improve until there's more clarity and it's changed. And I think that's the main thing also for foreign businesses. In all of the surveys that I've seen, that's what they identify as the largest problem right now, because it's very hard to plan and operate in what has become an on-off economy and this kind of extended period of uncertainty. There is also a question, will, Mr. Xi recover his pragmatic touch now that his third term is secured? There are quite a few kind of technocrats from across the country that have been promoted to the Politburo. Partially, I would posit because, there are only so many people with whom Mr. Xi at this point can promote that he has personal ties with. I mean, he's already been in Beijing in a central position for some time. But for foreign businesses, a lot are in what I would call a wait and see mode, or in, seeking ways to think about risk and resilience and agility in new ways. I kind of find in business chatter those terms are meaningless, and so I don't want to lean on them too heavily, because I think they're really defined based on industry and also the company values, stakeholder values, appetite, risk, etc. But you saw kind of decoupling everywhere except in the trade and investment data kind of until this year, where you've seen a real uptick in, particularly in the China market, people looking to diversify where possible or have secondary sources or backup plans, plan A and plan B and plan C. And I think that's going to be the case. Markets, investors, foreign businesses here would really a welcome return to pragmatism and predictability in China, but we're not seeing that at the moment. Bear in mind also that we're in the middle of a 5-year plan, so huge swings of policy coming out of the Party Congress would be surprising anyway, with the exception perhaps being more central action in the property sector, more comprehensive action from the central government, or on zero COVID. China, at the end of the day, is too attractive and important of a market, both in terms of its appeal as a source of consumers, but also its centrality in global supply chains, that foreign businesses are not going to walk away from it entirely. There's not going to be a mass corporate exodus, but you will perhaps see, for example, the FDI differential between China and ASEAN nations softening in the next few years, where capital is going to find somewhere to flow, right? But you might not put all of your eggs in the China basket at the moment. So I think a lot of companies, and this is something we're certainly hearing, are really trying to make sense of this current phase, this new era that we're seeing in China, and how to shape strategy around it.
And if we see now the Chinese economy weakening a little bit or being a little bit slower in terms of growth in the years ahead, would that mean that the consumer confidence will also decrease, is lower than before, and that they will be more careful about their spending? So would it be a good time to introduce more mass market products?
Yeah. Well, you're the experts on that, not so much me. I'll speak more generally to the macro picture. I think the slowdown was inevitable, right? No country, not even China, can maintain high, politically predetermined levels of growth in perpetuity. And in particular, as countries get richer and economies mature, there's just not enough room to grow at that pace, or at a very high pace. So that was inevitable. The slowdown has been made more painful, in particular this year, for reasons already discussed, mostly property, but especially zero COVID. And I think the consumer confidence issue at the moment is very tied to zero COVID, but China has also historically had a very low consumption to GDP ratio. And part of that just has to do with distribution. So there's a real question now, will common prosperity mean that we see property taxes and inheritance taxes and an actual redistribution of wealth to households in the lower and middle income brackets? And will that actually boost consumption? Not sure. I think, we are forecasting that this year China's growth will be around 3.3%. The September data that just came out yesterday for Q3 was slightly better than a lot of people had anticipated. We were very glad it was more or less in line with what we'd forecast. It was 3.9. We'd forecast 4. And we're also forecasting around 4.7 next year. But over the next 5 years, we think China will kind of moderate at around 3 to 4% growth, and that we're not going to go back to the glory days of growth for China. But that's still not necessarily a bad story. That's just what happens in more advanced economies. There's still going to be room for GDP per capita to increase. People are still, their lives are going to improve. They'll have more money. They'll have more money to spend in a consumer sense too. It's just going to be a slower process. And then the real question overall, though, and this is, I think, the challenge for China and for this new old administration, this same administration to some extent, or at least the third Xi administration, because he's not been able to do it in the first two, is whether China will rebalance its economy and undertake the reforms necessary to do so. Because it's not just about what are the growth numbers, it's also about where's the growth coming from. And if you're not going to just rely on construction, infrastructure, the property sector, exports to supercharge growth, but you want to, and this is in line with some of the policies that we've seen coming out of Beijing, find newer or more kind of quality, sustainable sources of growth, including boosting domestic consumptions, you need to see some policy shifts to make that happen. And so this is maybe something we'll look for moving forward, but I really don't see how any consumer confidence is going to be boosted as long as there's zero COVID. I mean, people are not, and the data bears this out. The surveys that have been done in China, particularly after the Shanghai lockdown, of Chinese consumers, the confidence level was extremely low, the lowest it's essentially ever been, but consumers also indicated they would only increase spending on food and education. And actually the data that came out from September of this year, by far and away, Q3, the expense that people most increased was food. And that's just response to, I think, people stocking up in case there's another lockdown. I don't think people are hungrier. I think they just want to be better prepared. And as long as zero COVID is here, yeah, you're going to, my freezer is full. I don't know about you, Damien, but just in case, right?
Yeah, my 3 freezers are full.
See, you're better prepared than I am. I'm impressed.
Yeah, even in Germany, people start to prepare for lockdowns or whatever will happen, or that there will be no electricity. So it's good. It's like the history taught that it's good to have some stock at home. And you already talked about the economic outlook of China, and I'm very happy to hear something quite optimistic, because it's not very often these days. And also I saw you talking on LinkedIn about the China growth story, and you said the China growth story is not over. Is it because there's no alternative to China? You already mentioned it, like Vietnam is not China, Singapore is not China, Thailand is not China. So is this a reason why China's growth story not over is yet? And can you explain a little bit about this outlook, this very optimistic outlook?
Oh, well, I'm grateful, Thomas. Everyone says I sound very pessimistic, and so maybe I'm just speaking more frankly these days. I mean, I think, the immediate outlook, candidly, is bleak. The economy basically already bottomed out in Q2 when we saw a near contraction, but the recovery remains very unbalanced and fragile. And I think there are real questions of whether we can, as I mentioned, rebalance the economy and get it on more sustainable footing, and whether the reforms that are necessary for that will ever see. That said, the reason I said China's growth story is not over is because 3% growth is still growth. That's still going to be higher than European growth is going to flatline next year. We're going to be falling into a recession. Even the US will be, I think, around 2%, slightly less. And so, advanced economies just don't grow at 8%. It just doesn't happen. But, if you look at even Japan, South Korea, when their kind of booms moderated, as I said, you still have rising per capita GDP, and there's still growth. It's just different. And so I think that's important, that people and businesses moderate their forecasts and expectations for China. I don't think we're going to be getting back even to 5-6%, let alone the kind of 8, 9, 10% that we'd seen over the past few decades. But that was inevitable. Again, it's just been harder and faster. It's been a harder and faster fall this year than what was necessary. And even the 8% growth from last year needs to be put in context. It was coming from the very low base point of about 2% in 2020, like the hard hit from the pandemic, and it was almost entirely exports. Candidly, especially with recessions coming, or already in some places in Europe, and the hard consequences of increasing consumer prices and inflation and depression, possibly in the U.S., Canada, other markets, there's decreasing and weakening demand for Chinese exports. So it's not going to be exports that's going to drive the data. And I guess this is also why it depends a little bit on how you look at it, because growth for growth's sake, like just having high numbers, doesn't really mean anything. And you can also just sort of see that with what we're, the efforts to deleverage the property sector now. But you can still unlock, opportunities in China. And as I sort of said, I still think it's a consequential market, and so not one that companies would be quick to abandon.
So now also Germany is discussing how to deal with its German-China relationship. Scholz is planning a trip to China now in early November, which is very interesting to see. And now there's a Chinese company who wants to buy shares or terminals at the Hamburg port, right? So this is being discussed in the media at the moment. A lot of people in Germany have an opinion about that. What do you think? Is it kind of dangerous to accept these deals? And how should Germany and the rest of Europe deal with China in the future?
So first of all, and maybe this is a contrarian view, I don't know how it's being covered in the German press, I commend Chancellor Scholz for going. I think it's the right choice, because in particular, coming out of the 20th Party Congress, it's clear that she is surrounded by loyalists. The question is, how many of them are going to be willing to bring him bad news or express candid views to him, right? If loyalty is what's most important, and she has not met with very many high-level leaders in recent years, obviously his trip to Uzbekistan being the first time he'd been outside of China, and it was, and also the lower level dialogues. I think, given what we've seen about the centralization of power, you can't rely on, a foreign minister's conversation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs being accurately conveyed. So I think actually having a European leader, having the German leader go and meet Xi face to face and explain things to him face to face is invaluable, and actually more foreign leaders should be doing it. And so I think that's really important. And I think that's actually an important demonstration of German leadership. And I hope other European leaders and actually other world leaders will follow suit. She is not going to come to us, so to speak. So you kind of have to go to him, particularly because of COVID and all the rest. But, the lower level dialogues, a lot of them have been suspended or shut down or compromised in many ways. They're not happening in person. They're happening virtually. And how much of that is actually being conveyed? At the end of the day, it's clear that she himself is making decisions here. Insofar as anything in Chinese politics is clear, which means it's clear as mud. It's not clear at all, but speculation and reading the tea leaves suggests that he's making the decisions. So I think when leaders of other countries can have candid and direct conversations with him personally, that only is valuable. I don't know that that's going to, lead to a productive relationship, but I think it's an important signal, and I think it's important to do. Obviously, German-Chinese trade is very significant. I think China's Germany's largest trading partner, if I recall correctly. It's like almost 300 billion euro or something, like 245, something like that. So anyway, so I actually commend that choice, and I hope we'll see other world leaders follow suit, because I think it's one of the only ways to constructively rebuild relations with China. On the port question, that's a pretty tricky one. I've seen very little about it, but I understand where it's coming from. The concern about national security, the concern about the ways in which not just China, but other companies or state-owned, whether they're state-owned enterprises or private enterprises with close ties to states getting access to critical infrastructure, whether it's a port, airport, you've seen it all around the world. There is a national security question there. And I think in particular this moment where, on the one hand, Thomas, you mentioned people being concerned about electricity. You could also be concerned about a nuclear annihilation in Europe right now. I'm not trying to be fear-mongering or war-mongering, but it's just so frightening to look at how many kind of geopolitical fires are burning at once at the moment. And so I understand the instinct to sort of say, let's not rush into this deal. Let's, see what we can build with with the relationship with China more broadly before we welcome this investment. At the same time, I think that the balance is to not be essentially racist in how you look at doing business with China, where it's like, and I think this is one of the criticisms that's been leveraged at the U.S., or to be seen as what we're seeing from the U.S., which is really using policy to constrain China in a very direct and confrontational way. I think that then you really do get into kind of a zero-sum race to the bottom in the relationship that we're seeing with the United States right now. And if Europe is also kind of engaged in that kind of dynamic, it's really, I think, we all suffer. The EU, China, and the US combined like 75% of global trade. So, having at least the EU and China get on a better trade footing, or Germany and China and maybe Europe coming along, I think would be a positive thing. So I'm not going to give an answer directly about whether or not the port deal should go through, because I think you can see it from both sides, but I understand the need to kind of have a robust kind of conversation and really consider the implications before taking any choices.
And as you said, forecasts are sometimes like also reading in the tea leaves, right? It's nothing that we cannot look in the future, but we can only see what risks and what chances are there. And as you said, we are in the middle of a 5-year plan, and we like to ask at the end of our interview our guests what are their personal 5 years plans. I mean, if I don't remember if we asked this question to you the last time we had you on the podcast, but these 6 months were like really crazy, and I think nobody could really predict it. But do you have a personal and professional outlook how China will develop in the coming 5 years, and how we, the experts in China, will do what our life will be in the next coming 5 years?
Yeah, it's candidly, I think it's a less fun time now than it has been. And most of that is related to COVID. And it's, perhaps also the very more virulent nationalism and how that's manifested sometimes. But I'm always hopeful for China. I do think it's going to be probably as I said, a more ideological period, and that, it doesn't feel great if you're interested in a business, or you're building a business or running a business here. Personally, I feel as though this time has more than ever underlined living in the moment, kind of the no day but today attitude. I'm actually very bad with uncertainty. I think for a long time last year, I was telling myself, oh, we've all gotten used to living with uncertainty. And now I just accept the fact that I really can't stand uncertainty. And so just focus on finding joy and really seizing it where you can. I also feel, and I don't know if you had this experience after lockdown, that my sense of time is completely warped. Like I'll sort of think it happened 2 years ago. It happened yesterday. I'm not sure. Like I just don't have a sense of like those 2 months being locked in my home have upended my understanding of time, which maybe is good in terms of being present. I mean, isn't that what the Buddha taught us or whomever? Like all the world religions are trying to tell you to behave well in this moment to some extent. Our family is choosing to stay, and and I'm here with kids, which of course complicates things quite a bit. And it feels strange because most of the expatriates are leaving. Of course, there's been a huge exodus, but there are still people coming. And for us, as we've, as a family, thought about it, one, we still find the joy in being here and still enjoy it. And we're not so pretentious as to think we act as bridges, so to speak. But I think it is also important. China is a consequential nation that's reshaping the world in some ways, whether we like it or not. And to sort of, to be engaged in that and be part of it is humbling. It's fascinating. It's enjoyable. And to also be here just living, we're going to stay as long as kind of China will have us. So hopefully that's, I don't know if we'll last another 5 years probably, but we'll have to see. Because at the same time, there are kind of red lines for us. We're not going to go another 3 years without seeing our family. We're going to leave every year and brave the quarantine. And it's important to see family. And so I think, that's the only catch, that there could be developments that are kind of beyond our control that would shift our commitment. But otherwise, we really intend to stay. And I do find it both personally and professionally rewarding. And I know that my family does too.
Very glad to hear that, and we wish you all the best, and are very thankful for these insights. This was very, very interesting for me, a lot of learning. Thank you so much for your time. Mattie Bekink, China Director at the Economist Intelligence Corporate Network. Thank you so much, Mattie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mattie.